Hey, this is Ranger Tim, and we're back in the classroom here at the Learning Center at Jones Gap State Park. Earlier on, we had gone out in the field and collected some abiotic data, that non-living data, about things like the rocks and the water and the air, and those things associated with this cold water habitat of the Middle Saluda River. We also collected organisms, the biota, the living component, brought them up to the laboratory, and what you and I are going to do together is, by doing some comparing and contrasting of the organisms under the microscope, and using the identification sheet, we're going to see if we can identify who lives here. So let's take a look at that identification sheet first. All right, if you look on here, you're going to notice that this is a key for macroinvertebrates, animals without a backbone, that are large enough to see with the unaided eye, not without the microscope. We're going to look to see for the presence of things like legs or a shell. If it has legs, how many legs does it have? So we'll look at the organism, then we'll come back to the screen and see if we can identify what we have. Are you ready? Well, let's take a look at our first animal. If you remember earlier down by the stream when we picked up a rock and there was this little round circle on there, it was very tiny, it was kind of hard to see. Well, now that we have it magnified, you can see that it has a lot of features more than just being a little round camouflage disc. So the first thing you might want to note, as I mentioned, is the shape of the animal. One thing that scientists utilize to help identify organisms is, what shape is it? You also might notice on here that it has legs. How many legs does this animal have? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 legs. So we already know we have an animal with 6 legs. So what group of animals does that put that in? Would it be a bird? Would it be a flower? Or would it be an insect? Right, it's an insect. All right, so it's round, 6 legs. Also, I'm going to zoom in again. Notice these little white feathery structures that are right here on the animal. Follow the arrow. I'm going to zoom and refocus. Here we go. This is what allows this animal to be able to breathe underwater. What do animals that breathe underwater utilize? Yeah, they use oxygen, just like we do. The difference is they remove that oxygen from the water. We call that dissolved oxygen. So we've got a macroinvertebrate from a cold water habitat, circular in shape, 6-legged. Let's go to our identification, see if we identify it if we can. All right, so we're going to look around on here to see if we recognize anything that might be circular. So we've got this, which is somewhat circular, so it could be a clam. We've got this, which is somewhat circular. Maybe if we stretch it a little bit, that might be a little bit circular. Maybe one of the snails. So maybe one of the snails, a clam, or a water penny. Which one do you think it might be? If you identified it as being the water penny, you're correct. The water penny is actually the larva stage of a beetle. You may be familiar with beetles like fireflies or lightning bugs, or maybe ladybug beetles that are out there. So it is the larva stage, and if you think about the life cycle of insects, you learned this back when you learned about butterflies, maybe the 1st or 2nd grade. You go from an egg to a larva, which we call a caterpillar, to a pupa stage, and then an adult stage. In this case, this one is in the larva stage, so as an adult, it's going to look very different. As a matter of fact, it won't live on the bottom of the rock, it's going to live on the surface. Okay? All right, good job. Let's take a look at the next one. There you go. We're just going to observe it for a few moments. Looking for shape, size, any patterns. Is there any movement? Is it doing anything? Oh, you may have noticed there's a little something starting to come out of the shell over here. A little movement through there. So the organism we're looking at has a shell on the outside, and there's an opening in that shell in which there is part of the body part that's extending out. Also, what I want you to note on this is that if the point of the shell is at the top and the opening is on the right side of the screen, or is it on the left? In this case, it's on the right-hand side. That's going to be important for identifying this snail. All right, so we're going to look on here to see if we have any animals that have shells. So take a moment and look. So we have a gilled snail, we have a lung snail, and we have clams. All three of these have shells on them. If you remember, on our shell with the point at the top, was the opening on the right or was it on the left? If you identified it as being the gilled snail, single shell opening to the right, and you got it. And the name tells you a little bit about it. We saw the gills on the water penny before. The gilled snail also has gills, which allows it to be able to remove that oxygen from the water. All right. You guys ready for your third one? Let's see what we got next. Here we go. Look at that. Look at all that motion going on back here on the abdomen. By the way, how many body parts does an insect have? 3. You've got a head, a thorax, which has your parts that are used for movement, in this case legs, and you can see the development of the wings, which we'll be using later. So back on the abdomen, we have this movement that's there. Those are the gills, which once again, those gills allow that animal, just like the gilled snail or the water penny or a fish, it allows them to be able to remove oxygen from the water. So we've got 6 legs. The body's, well, is it long or is it oval? And then we're going to go back to see if it has tails or not. If we look back here on the tip of the abdomen, you can look that it has tails. Count how many. So we have a 6-legged invertebrate, 3 long tails, gills on the abdomen. I'm going to zoom in a little closer to the head. And I'll have to refocus for you. Here we go. We can also see that this animal has a pair of antennae. Not real long, but it's a pair of antennae. If you look in there, you can also see that it's got that compound eye on there. We're going to come back out. All right, let's take a look at our identification sheet and see if we can find a 6-legged macroinvertebrate with 3 long tails. All right, I'm going to give you a moment, look up on there. Look for those animals with legs, or the absence of. Look for ones that might have 3 tails. In this case, 3 long tails. So we have the mayfly nymph, 6 legs, 3 long tails, and we have a damselfly that also has 3 tails, but notice how wide they are. So as we compare, see how they're the same, contrast, see how they're different. So you think our animal is a mayfly nymph or a damselfly nymph? Great, it's a mayfly nymph. That word nymph indicates that it's in this juvenile state. In other words, it's not an adult yet. In this case, it goes from an egg to a nymph. Looks just like the parents, or almost like the parents. And then the adult stage will have those wings that we saw earlier, be fully developed, and it will come out of the water, and then it'll fly around. But when it hits the surface of the water, those wings are wet, and it's going to have to dry them off, hopefully before a predator comes up from underneath and recycles that mayfly nymph. You see the beginning of those wings coming in. Those wings will get much larger before it actually is able to emerge and fly out of the water and become terrestrial. The scientific name for this is really fun. It's called an ephemeroptera. It comes from the word ephemeral, which means short-lived, and the word ptera that begins with a P, P-T-E-R-A, means it's short-lived with wings, because as an adult, most of these only live about 24 hours, 1 day as an adult. Kind of a neat little animal. All right, let's see what else we got. All right, so what do you see? Yeah, it's sand. It looks like rocks, but it's actually sand magnified. But what I want you to notice is that there are lots of individual pieces of sand that are all attached together. Do you remember when we were looking on the rocks down by the river, picked it up, and we're talking about camouflage, how you look the same. All right? But we can still identify this one just by having that. So let's go to the identification sheet. Just knowing it's a long tube made of sand or rocks. If you notice right here, we have something that looks elongated or long tube that's made out of little small structures. This is the case of the caddisfly larvae. And remember, the caddisfly larvae is closely related to the butterflies and moths, and it uses that silk to glue these pieces of rock together, in this case, to build a cage in which to live inside of. So caddisfly larvae, let's go back to that. I can tell you we're not going to see the animal, and here's how I know. If you look on the end of the tube, right there where the arrow is pointing, there is a small rock covering that end of the tube. And if I go to the other end, you'll notice the same thing. There is a rock closing that end of the tube, indicating the front door and the back door are closed. This animal is in the pupa stage. Inside of there is this amazing change taking place where what once looked like a little small caterpillar that was underwater is now changing into an adult, which will have wings, legs, and will fly around in the forest around the river. Okay? So that's one of the ways we can tell that that's taking place. Had we looked in there and the front door, so to speak, been open, then that means that the larva could have been in there and we could have looked around in there to see if it came out, or it had already emerged. It would have came out of there, floated to the surface like we talked about with the mayfly, tried to dry those wings off as quickly as possible before something like a rainbow trout or a salamander or something came up and took that energy and moved it in a different direction on that. All right, so while we're looking at caddisflies, you notice it's got long pieces of wood or sticks that are here, and then small pieces of wood and leaves that it's actually used to attach these sticks together. This is called the log cabin caddisfly because it utilizes sticks. It looks like if it's home, it's not going to come out. So let's take a look at that key so you can see what it looked like and see if you can find that on there. Great, there you go. Log cabin builder. One of the caddisfly larvae. Our next animal we're going to look at is a little too large to be inside the microscope, so we've got it in a little bigger bowl. You might recognize this one right away by those large claws that it has on the front. Also notice these long antennae coming out of there. This animal actually has 10 legs, so therefore we would call it a decapod. Deca meaning 10, pod meaning foot. Kind of like a tripod has 3, right? So we've got these big set of pincers on the front, long antennae, sort of a flattened out tail for swimming. All right. Notice it's also very bright red in color. That's due to the fact that this animal has just recently molted and its shell is very soft, but we're trying to be very careful with it so we don't damage it. It's also why it's probably not being quite so defensive and using those claws and pinching me. It's trying to protect those until they harden up. So let's use that information and we're going to switch over to our key, which is on the screen there. Just a little quick switch over. And then take a look. 10 legs, long pair of pincers on there. Yeah, really only one choice up there with big sets of pincers that we can actually see right here in the middle. And we've got 1, 2, 3, 4 on each side, a total of 8. And then there's 2 more underneath the front there that you can't quite see. So that's a crayfish, so another one of our macroinvertebrates that lives in this cold water habitat. We have another one of our macroinvertebrates that we collected down in the middle Saluda River today. Notice how this one's sitting up on the surface of the water, kind of moving around. These other organisms, as I mentioned before, are underneath the water, down underneath the rocks, hiding in there, keeping from being washed away, but also hiding from those predators. This was not so much worried about its predators. Scientists have done a little bit of research and they think that this animal pretty much probably has a pretty bad taste to it, and that may be one of the reasons it's not fed upon very easily, so it feels pretty confident running around on the surface. Speaking of moving around on the surface, notice it's got a long body with these 6 legs sticking out. 4 of them are very easy to see. The other 2 are a little bit smaller and they serve a little bit different purpose. They're not necessarily for movement, but more for grasping and holding on to their prey, as they do eat live things. Okay? This one's not going to be on our sheet, so I'm going to tell you what this one is, and you may already know what it is. It's called a water strider. That's S-T-R-I-D-E-R, water strider. And there are many species of water striders as well. Sometimes people will call them a water spider. But of course, spiders have 8 legs, right? And they're not insects. So this is a water strider, 6-legged, 3 body part predator that lives on the surface of the water. Our last animal that we're going to identify as part of our lab component of identifying who lives in this cold water habitat of the Middle Saluda River only has 4 legs. So let's take a moment and observe to see what else you might notice about the shape of the body, about the movement. Notice it has an elongated tail. If you kind of look at it, you can tell that it gets sort of narrow as you move from the base of the tail, which is up near the legs, out toward the tip. It's because it's flattened on the side, kind of like a paddle you might use to paddle your canoe or your kayak. And that flattened out tail allows it to be able to be used like for propulsion, for movement, but it can also be used like a rudder. In other words, kind of like steering a boat. So 4 legs, elongated body, flattened tail, actually is keeled, that's K-E-E-L-E-D, just sort of triangular in shape. Notice it's got 2 large eyes, very prominent, sitting on top of the head there. This animal won't be on our macroinvertebrate key because this animal is a vertebrate. It is an animal that has a backbone. Has that very moist skin. And this is a salamander. And this salamander is from a group of salamanders that have a lot of different variety to them. So we refer to this as a mountain dusky, D-U-S-K-Y, mountain dusky salamander. All right, what a great day being down by the Middle Saluda River here at Jones Gap State Park. I always love getting out there and exploring these cold water habitats, and it's always fun to have people joining me doing that, be it here or remotely. Some of the things that we were able to observe today, and some of the things that we were able to learn, hopefully, about cold water habitats, is they need that water temperature that's going to stay below 20 degrees Celsius on average throughout the year. They need clear water. We also referenced that they need a lot of dissolved oxygen. Remember, as we looked at the water penny and the gill snail, all those other organisms, they had those gill structures that allow them to take that oxygen out of the water. So remember that as we did identification work, that almost every animal that we identified today was in group 1, being very indicative or telling us a lot that the Middle Saluda River has very high water quality in terms of providing a home for living organisms that require cold water habitat. So on behalf of everybody here at Jones Gap, I'm Ranger Tim, saying goodbye.